Hey folks, David Molnar here. Welcome back to the final video in our Aperture video series. In this video, we're going to recap all the lessons that we learned. All right, so in chapter 1, we talked about what is aperture. Well, aperture, simply put, is the size of the hole, okay, that is inside your lens. Pretty much every lens has an aperture, and you can adjust the size of that hole that is inside your lens. Let me show you an example. This right now is a very large size aperture, and I can adjust the size of the hole that is inside the lens to be smaller or anywhere in between. Now, when you take control of this, you can directly affect the exposure, which brings me to chapter 2 of this article in this video series, right? What is exposure and how does aperture fit in? Well, exposure, simply put, is the brightness of an image. A correct exposure is an image that is not too bright and not too dark. And just like you saw a second ago where I was changing the physical size of the hole inside the lens, I was changing the aperture, which is that hole in the lens. The smaller hole will let less light come in, and the larger hole will let more light come in, okay? So aperture directly affects the brightness because depending on how you change the size of that hole, it's gonna let more or less light come in. All right, so in chapter 3, we talked about f-stops. What are f-stops? F-stops are the increment that the size of the hole is measured in, okay? So simply put, it's a little bit confusing with f-stops because f-stops are the exact opposite of what you would think. When we say f1.8, you might think that is a small hole, but in reality, right now we are at f1.8 on this lens, and that's actually the largest hole that this lens allows you to do. It's the maximum aperture size. If I stop all the way down to this smallest hole, it's f22. Okay, so f-stops are the increment that the size of the hole is actually measured in, and the larger that number is actually a smaller hole. And inversely, the larger the size hole is actually a smaller number. So it's the opposite of what you might expect. All right, so in chapter 4, we talked about depth of field and how aperture directly affects the depth of field. So what is depth of field? Depth of field is the amount of space that is in focus. It is not where is in focus, it is how much depth is in focus in your image. And aperture directly affects how much distance, how much depth you have that is actually in focus. Here's how it works. The larger size aperture, okay, which is actually that smaller number, like f2.0 or something, right? The larger that size of the hole actually creates a narrower or shallower depth of field. Less distance will be in focus. The background will be more blurry when you have a larger hole. And inversely, when you have a smaller aperture size, which of course is a larger number like f22, you will actually have more distance or more depth in focus, okay? f22 might give you the largest depth of field, will give you the largest depth of field that your lens will allow. And it might have your subject or the flowers or your portraits, the subject of your portrait face perfectly crisp and in focus, and it might also have the background, the mountains in the background in focus and crisp as well. So real quick, larger hole, shallower depth of field, more blurry background. Smaller hole, more crisp, more in focus background. Chapter 5, we talked about bokeh. What is bokeh? Well, it originates from the Japanese word, which simply means blur. Some people say bokeh, some people say bokeh. We'll never know what you're supposed to say. It's a little bit controversial. What is bokeh? It's simply referring to the blurred area of an image. So if everything is in focus, there is no bokeh. What is good bokeh versus bad bokeh? This is a little bit of a controversy as well, but typically people think that an image where the specular highlights or circles, the blurred circles in a shallow depth of field image, if they are circles, like true beautiful rounded circles, a lot of people would say that is a good or beautiful bokeh. If the circles are not circles, but in fact are hexagons or pentagons or octagons, and they have more straight edges, then some people would say that is actually a bad or unpleasant bokeh. Whatever you think, bokeh is a word to describe the aesthetic quality of the blurred area. And if there is no blurred area in your image, there is no bokeh. In chapter 6, we talk about how to actually change your aperture, which remember is the size of the hole that's inside of your lens. Now, every camera is a little bit different in the way that it requires you to twist a dial or push a button and then twist a dial. Different brands have different ways to do it, but essentially what you're doing is you are changing the physical size of that hole when you change the aperture size. So if you don't remember that lesson, go back and watch chapter 6, watch that lesson, and try to see if you can figure out with a camera that looks just like yours, how to actually change that aperture, because that will give you a lot more room to play when you're taking pictures. In chapter 7, we talked about aperture in certain lenses and how certain lenses are more limited than other lenses, specifically like kit lenses that come with a lot of the camera bodies that you guys might have purchased. So remember, aperture is the size of the hole, and different lenses will have a larger or smaller maximum aperture size depending on how expensive they are, whether a fixed lens like this or whether they're a variable zoom lens like this, okay? And here's what you need to understand. The larger the aperture size, the size of the hole, which of course is a smaller number, it will allow more light to come in, which will allow you to do two things. Shoot in lower light situations like at night or indoors, or just in more difficult lighting situations like in the gym and all those things. And if it's a larger size hole, it will allow you to have a more shallow depth of field or blur that background even more. Now, when you have a kit lens, like the 18 to 55 millimeter lens that comes with this Nikon D3400 in many cameras like the Canon Rebel, they have the exact same version of it, right? A lot of these kit lenses, pretty much all of the kit lenses, have limitations in that they are a variable maximum aperture. This one specifically is aperture f-stop 3.5 to 5.6. So what that means, I'll zoom all the way out to 18 millimeters, which is pretty wide. What that means is when you're shooting wide, you can open up the aperture size to 3.5. Now, it's not very large. It's decently large. It's kind of a middle of the aperture, okay? So it can't let tons of light in. But what happens is when you zoom in closer to your subject, I'm zoomed in now to 55 millimeters, which is a little bit closer to your subject, right? This lens forces you to reduce that maximum aperture size from 3.5 to a smaller hole at 5.6. So what does that mean? That means that if you're shooting in the gym, if you're shooting indoors, if you're shooting in a lower light situation, that all of a sudden you're a little bit handicapped in that you can't let as much light come in anymore if you want to zoom in closer to your subject. So it's not that these lenses are bad, they're just kind of cheaply made so that they can throw them in as a package deal for you and you can take great pictures outside or in great quality light. When you get into lower light situations, these types of lenses are not necessarily ideal. Now, there are two other types of lenses. There is a fixed lens, and for instance, this is the Nikon 50mm 1.8. So the 1.8 is denoting that you can open up your aperture all the way to 1.8, which lets a lot of light come in. So you can shoot in much lower light situations and you can get a much more blurry background or shallower depth of field if you're trying to take those gorgeous portraits where the background is super blurry. But the limitation with this lens is that it doesn't zoom in or out, right? It is a fixed focal length. It's a fixed 50mm lens, meaning if you want to get closer to your subject, you have to actually walk closer to your subject, okay? You can't just zoom in or zoom out, but it will allow you to shoot in lower light situations and blur that background more. Now, the other type of lens is kind of a much more expensive lens, and every type of brand, Nikon, Sony, Canon, they all have their versions of this. This is the Canon version, it's a 24 to 70, but the aperture is a fixed 2.8. Now remember, the maximum aperture on this Nikon and Canon fixed lenses were 3.5, but as you zoom in, it forces you to make a smaller hole. With a lens like this, like the Canon L series lens, you can stay at 2.8 the entire time, regardless of whether you zoom in or out. It's a fixed maximum aperture of 2.8, which means that you can open up to 2.8, which lets a lot of light come in, and you can shoot at a pretty shallow depth of field, and it doesn't force you to make that hole smaller as you zoom in closer to your subject. So basically, more expensive lenses, when they're zoom lenses, you can have a fixed aperture and you can get a higher quality image, okay? So you just have some limitations with the kit lenses that come. What do I recommend doing? I recommend buying the Canon 50, or Canon, if you have a Nikon camera, the Nikon version, but I recommend you buying what's called the Nifty 50, which is this lens right here. It's $150 to $200 depending on where you get it and what time of year, and it can let a lot of light come in. It's great for portraits. It's just a really fun, inexpensive lens that you can take world-class images with, so that's what I recommend. So in chapter 8, we talked about how aperture can kind of change its effect when you're using different focal lengths, when you're zooming in or zooming out, okay? Let's say the example we used in that lesson where if you were shooting at f4.0, which is a pretty middle of the road aperture size, the way the background is going to blur, the way the aperture is going to affect the image is going to significantly change when you're zoomed all the way out and when you're zoomed all the way in. In chapter 9, we talked about recommended apertures, different starting places for different situations. So if you're shooting one person, I recommend you shoot f2.8 as a starting place because that will give you a pretty shallow depth of field, but not too shallow. If you're shooting two people, my recommended aperture starting place is 4.0 to 5.6 because it will give you a little bit deeper depth of field and hopefully you'll get both of your subject's eyes in focus. If you're shooting a larger group, let's say with 1, 2, or 3 rows, like 8 or 10 people, my recommended aperture starting place is f8 to f11 so that you can have everyone in focus in all 3 of the rows, let's say if you're shooting a big group portrait. And finally, my recommended aperture for if you're shooting landscapes and you want everything to be in focus, the mountains, the flowers in the foreground, and everything is f22. And that also will give you a little bit of leeway if you want to put your camera on a tripod and drag the shutter so that you can take a long exposure and let water flow through your images. All right, so in chapter 10, we talked about how aperture changes sun flare. And simply put, if you have a larger size hole, which is that smaller number, you're gonna see more of a blob when you're looking at the sun flare in your images. As you close down that hole to a larger aperture number, but of course a smaller hole, you're gonna see the sun itself be more defined and look more like a star burst. In chapter 11, we had a very advanced lesson, the most advanced lesson. We talked about how aperture is really the only thing that affects how you measure the power of a strobe and specifically how you get a correct exposure on your subject's face or whatever your subject is. So simply put, once you set the ISO, because you have such a large output of light that's usually coming from a flash, you can usually set your ISO to around 100 or 200, but then you just leave it there. You kind of forget it and you don't worry about it again, okay? And the amount of time that the strobe is happening is like a 4 or 5,000th of a second. It's there and gone so fast that really the amount of time that you take the picture doesn't affect how the light hits your subject. As long as you catch that strobe, that flash of light, okay, when you're taking the picture, the amount of time doesn't really matter. So the only thing that really does matter is the size of the hole, because the larger that size of the hole, more light will come through. And the smaller that hole, less light will come through. So really, when you're talking about strobes from a flash, okay, aperture is the only thing that matters. All right, folks, you have learned so much in this free video series on aperture, and I'm so excited for you because you're gonna go out and start taking much, much better images. But there are a lot of you guys who aren't taking the images yet that you see in your head, that you know that you have inside of you. You have these world-class images and you just don't know how to bring them to life yet. Well, hey, you are in luck because I have a brand new free web class that I wanna personally invite you to take, where I'm gonna go even more in depth on aperture, and I'm also going to teach you about ISO and shutter speed so that you can take full manual control of your camera and show your camera who's boss. So if you're interested in taking my free web class, click the link below this video, sign up, and I'm super excited because you're going to learn some amazing stuff. Well, hey, regardless of what you do, thank you so much for taking this free video series on aperture. I hope you learned tons and tons of stuff, and I'm so excited to be your photography mentor and help you along in your journey. I'll see you soon.